Hello, fellow historians. Welcome to week 6. I cannot believe we're already in week 6, but we're talking about fundamentalism versus modernism this week. And lots of you have picked really cool people to talk about in the Scopes trial and everything else. But I wanted to talk about a guy this week who's a little bit ahead of his time, Charles A. Briggs. He was born Presbyterian and later became an Episcopalian after he was excommunicated from the Presbyterian Church for his views on the Bible. He was born in 1841, so he lived through the Civil War, and then later, I believe it was 1866, somewhere around there, he went to Berlin to study, and there he studied sciences, and he came back after 3 years with a changed theology on the Bible. Some of that was due to the influences of the college, but a lot of it he wanted to try to marry together this idea of these new ideas of what science was and what was possible, and this realistic view of the history of the world, and these fantastical tales of the Bible and the Old Testament, especially. It was his interpretation of the Old Testament that really got the church going. So, two different accounts in the newspapers that I found. One was in the Baltimore Sun from our databases, and the other was a Helena Independent from the Library of Congress. And the Baltimore Sun was much more factual. It outlined the defense of Briggs and the prosecution, the arguments of the prosecuting the church of him at his heresy trial. But and it was interesting. His defense was essentially an admission that yes, that was exactly what I'm saying. What you're accusing me of is exactly what I'm saying. But he really believed that he was right and that the Bible could be true. It just wasn't perfect. And if you are a fundamentalist, like I discovered this week, suddenly I am, because I do believe in the inerrancy and the literal interpretation of the Bible, then they completely disagreed with him. So, anyway, that was the much more factual um, discussion of the case. The Helena Independent from the Library of Congress, I actually want to read a little bit of it. It asked much more broad questions. It was less, it happened, this was written right before the trial. It rated the trial as being one of the most important. It says in the very beginning that two famous heresy trials in the history of the Presbyterian Church in America. The first split the church, and the second shook it so violently that the effect was felt for 10 years afterward. So Albert Barnes and David Swing were the two heresy trials it was discussing. And then it said that soon the trial of Reverend Charles A. Briggs would be added to that rank. And it goes on to say later that it asks, how will the Presbyterian Church survive if they find Dr. Briggs guilty and they excommunicate him? Because how many other preachers are preaching the same thing? It says that, can the church withstand the shock of a dozen or 100 such trials? Would it seem to be logically necessary after the first? So these are the kinds of questions that before the trial that I would imagine that the Presbyterians were really wrestling with as well. And they had no idea what was coming in the next 50 years or so when modernism would really push. And then we eventually get to the Scopes trial in 1925, where we really see the public eye kind of come down hard on fundamentalism, and they just sort of retreated, as we found out. The main point of all of this that I'm saying, the importance of Charles Briggs, is that there's a lot happening during this time and after with modernism versus fundamentalism. And I don't know if he was really the first crack in the dam of fundamentalism in America, but he was certainly a part of the first chapter of the church coming away from the literal interpretation of the Bible and sliding more towards the modernist interpretation. So he's very fascinating to study, and if you get a chance to look at the newspapers that I've linked below, definitely do that because they're fascinating to read. Thank you very much for listening.